If you were to look specifically at the Western world and wanted to identify some of its peculiar features or traits, you might come up with some of these. And I'll just briefly list these. The idea of rational scientific inquiry, that there is a rational understanding of the world and why the world performs and acts the way it does, and that understanding can be reached by scientific investigation. It's very much a part, an inherent idea within the West. The idea of change, that things change, that things are in a constant state of flux, and transition from one point to the next, is very much part of the Western way, which is not necessarily the same with Indian or Chinese societies. It's a little bit different there. So rational scientific inquiry, change, the value of the individual. Deeply ingrained in the West is the value of the individual, that the individual is worth something, and the individual is very special. Violence, very much a part of the Western world. And violence is especially evident in the rise and fall of different Western cultures. And you can tick them all off. You can tick off Egypt, Babylon, Greece, Rome, Islam, Byzantium, England, America, whatever. But there is this characteristic of the rise and fall of cultures within the West. And part of the reason for that is this inherent violent streak that runs within the West. And finally, another peculiarity of the West is something that has occurred over the last 4,000 years in the West, and that is the gradual separation of church and state. At one time, at the very beginning, there was no distinction between church and state. Church was state, state was church. Religion explained everything, religion ran everything. Over the course of the next 1,000 years, gradually they shifted into their own distinct spheres. And that culminated in the American constitutional experience of the 18th century, when there was a legal distinction drawn between those two spheres. But when you're going through this course and you're studying events, notice how that happens over time. Notice how gradually people come up with that concept that there is something different about these two different worlds. And let me just go into some detail about this idea of the individual in the West, because above all, I think that the Western world is built on a three-part foundation, and all three of these parts serve to reinforce this, shall we say, love of individualism within the West. And the first of these pieces of the foundation, the first stone, we trace back to the ancient Hebrews. Now, the Hebrews are important because it is from their religion, from Judaism, that Christianity and Islam later emerged. Thus, three of the world's major religions today, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are all tied together. They all share a common origin, and that's in the ancient Hebrews. What tied them all together was something that historians call ethical monotheism. Ethical monotheism. The ancient Hebrews, completely insignificant from a political, cultural point of view, defined a new religious system. A religious system based on the idea of one God who demands personal, responsible, moral behavior from his subjects. One God who demands personal, responsible, moral behavior from his subjects. Not rituals, not sacrifices, not prayers, not prostrations, but upright behavior is what was the new code of the religion. With regard to the West individualism, this was crucial because the Hebrews introduced the idea of individual responsibility. Each individual was responsible for his own actions before God. It wasn't the community that was responsible, but you yourself were responsible. And this kind of laid down in stone the worth of the individual, that individual is what mattered and not community of people. We go to the Greeks for the second stone in this part of the foundation. And the Greeks were unique because very early on in their existence, already in the 6th century BC, they abandoned gods, or religion, as an explanatory force of the world around them. That it was no longer gods who moved stones or gods who moved rivers or anything, but there was another reason. And instead, they turned to rational inquiry. The idea that the human mind, by observing the world around him, could explain the world. He didn't have to resort to divine tricks or a heaven-centered system to explain the world, but the human mind itself could do that. And as a result, the world became centered on man, not on God, but man became the center of the world. And this is clearly seen in two old Greek proverbs or maxims. The first, know thyself. And the second, man is the measure of all things. In a way, individual. Man is the center. The individual is what matters, not the world around him or not God. And this reinforced in a slightly different way the individual responsibility that the ancient Hebrews had elaborated. Finally, the Romans. The Romans have gone down into the pages of history as the pioneers in the areas of government, administration, law. Pioneers in the practical affairs of man. In this respect, they also added to the notion of individual responsibility. But in a different context, and that context would be the notion of civic duties of the individual. Each man has, in return for the rights and privileges that you get for being a citizen of Rome, you have certain obligations. You are a citizen, you get these rights, but you have obligations. You have the obligation to participate in political and civic affairs. You have the obligation to uphold the law. You, as an individual, are responsible to the state. So this, in another slightly different context, reinforced this whole notion of the individual in the ancient world. It gave some value to him above the state or above God or above nature around him and everything. And that is really the essence of what the West has come to mean. And if you look at the West today, or the recent history of the West in the 20th century, you'll see a lot of things that reinforce that. And three developments I thought of when I was thinking of this course were Freud's idea of psychoanalysis, the UN Charter, and the development of the personal computer. All three of these very much are part of the West individualism. Freud's psychoanalysis, the reversion to the inner self or something that's important, very much in the individual. The UN Charter, the concern for human rights, individual rights in the Western world. The personal computer that allows the individual to fulfill his abilities and capabilities. If you look at different developments within the Western world, you see how this concern with individual rights, the individual, is very much reflected in the history of the West. One small addendum I'd like to make at this point is that in this part of the course, when we get to the fall of the Roman Empire, there was a temporary setback in this development of individualism of the West, temporary setback in the development and dominance of Greek and Roman rationalism. And that is because all three of the states that succeeded Rome, Byzantine civilization, Muslim civilization, and Western Europe, all three of these civilizations were very much dominated by three different churches. The Eastern Orthodox Church, Islam, and the Roman Catholic Church in the West. And in all three cases, religion again emerged to the forefront. Religion emerged as the explanation of the world and society and mankind. And as a result, for a period of time from roughly, we say 450 until the Renaissance, maybe 900 years, the individualism of man was again temporarily submerged under the weight of religion and the overwhelming concern with the afterlife and heaven. But with the Renaissance, that again emerged dominant and kind of triumphant in the West.